Okay, hi everyone. I think we are live, so just getting ready. Hello from me, Donald Robertson, and Mickey the dog, who you can probably see in her armchair behind me in Nova Scotia. If you can all hear me and see me okay, just say so in the live chat on the left hand side of the YouTube player. And just take a moment to say where you're from. We're here in Canada, so it's kind of interesting just to see what parts of the world people are viewing from. So I'll just check in a minute and have a look at that. Before that, I'll just do a little bit of general housekeeping. There is a 30-second delay, as far as I can tell from timing it, between your chat and my responses to it. So sometimes there might be a little bit of a pause between me responding to things. I'd also ask you to put an asterisk in front of any questions that you want to ask me directly, because otherwise, if there's a bit of discussion going on in live chat, it can be difficult for me to spot things. So just to highlight a question that you want me to answer, if you stick an asterisk in front of it, it's easier for me to find it. The session today should last 15-20 minutes. I'm not very good at estimating the time on these things. Usually it's about 5 minutes more than I think it's going to be. And I'm mainly going to be talking about my new course, which is called How to Think Like a Roman Emperor, and it's about the Stoicism of Marcus Aurelius and how to apply that to modern living. This video will be permanent on YouTube, so you'll be able to go back and view it at any time if you miss part of it or whatever, if you're kind of have to leave before the end. So the agenda for today is basically I'm going to say a little bit about my background, just to introduce me to anybody who hasn't met me before, and then I'll talk a little bit more about kind of what led me to design this course, why it's important to me, and I'm also going to mention a special offer that you might be interested in, so I'll come back to that a little bit later. Before I do that, let me briefly just check in and make sure that we are definitely all good. Yeah, hi everybody. We have got people from Maryland, from Dallas, Texas, and somebody from Amsterdam. So if you're just joining us late, if you just want to chip into the live chat and say hi and where you're from, and I presume from that everybody can hear my audio fine and that you're all getting the video and stuff. So I shall continue. So my name is Donald Robertson, as mentioned earlier, in case you haven't met me before. So I'll say a little bit about how I became interested in Stoicism. I've told this story many times before, as you can imagine. I studied philosophy at university a really long time ago. I went to Aberdeen University in the north of Scotland, and one of my favourite philosophers actually was Thomas Reid, who was from that area. He's not a very well known philosopher. But at university, we studied every philosopher under the sun, apart from the Stoics, really. And I was, when I was about 15 onwards, really, I was very interested in self-help and personal development, like a lot of people are. I was into meditation and self-hypnosis. I remember at one point I wanted to be a psychoanalyst. I went through a phase of being really into Freud, and that's my big dream about what I wanted to do. And then I ended up at university in Aberdeen doing my degree in philosophy. As part of that, I also studied history of Indian religions, and I was a member of the Buddhist Society, and I used to practice Buddhist meditation and go on Buddhist retreats and stuff like that. And I kind of felt that I had this desire to somehow bring together the various interests that I had. I was interested in psychology, mainly psychotherapy. I was interested in kind of personal development, meditation, Buddhism, and like Hinduism actually as well. And I was interested in academic philosophy. And I really wanted to find a way to bring these together. And the first way that I tried to do that was actually through studying existentialism. Because there's a kind of intersection between existential philosophy and psychoanalysis, but that was kind of a bit of a dead end, and historically it didn't really work out, and it wasn't really giving me what I needed. And then by chance, I kind of stumbled across Stoicism after I'd finished studying philosophy. Around the time I was beginning to train as a psychotherapist and a counsellor, and it just kind of clicked with me, and I guess it clicked permanently because 20 years later I'm still completely immersed in studying Stoicism, so I guess it became a kind of permanent thing. And it brought all of my interests together. I'll tell you how people often describe Stoicism to me. I've been incredibly privileged over the years to be able to meet thousands of people around the world, online, and in various different contexts. That's no exaggeration, by the way. We've probably had almost 10,000 people doing all of our online courses over the years. And, the conference this year, there's going to be 400 people at that. So I meet a lot of people who are interested in Stoicism. And I think I'm incredibly lucky to have been able to do that. And I listen to what they say, and I've learned a lot from the kind of stuff that they say. Sometimes it confirms my views, sometimes it's different, but it's interesting to notice what people take from Stoicism. And one of the things people say is it's kind of like Buddhism, but it's more Western. Like, there's a kind of deja vu feeling because there's a lot of stuff that they find recognisable in Stoicism. Some of the sayings and concepts seem kind of familiar to them from their own culture in a way that maybe Oriental philosophy, Buddhism doesn't. And so some people say it's like a Western yoga or a European or a Western Buddhism. Some people have told me they see Stoicism as being like Christianity, but somehow more of a philosophy than a religion, more based on reason rather than on faith or on tradition like religions generally are. And some people say it's like academic philosophy, but more down to earth and more practical and more of a way of life. So those are some of the ways that people have of describing it. And as a therapist, what I've always said is it's kind of like CBT in some ways, which is no coincidence because CBT evolved in part out of an inspiration from Stoicism. Albert Ellis in particular had read Epictetus and Marcus Aurelius, one of the pioneers of CBT. And but Stoicism is bigger and deeper than psychotherapy. It's psychotherapy. CBT in particular is time limited. You're meant to do it and then you kind of stop. I mean, there may be techniques people continue to use over time or changes in attitudes that continue, but CBT is by definition a time limited relationship, and Stoicism isn't. Stoicism is an entire way of life, worldview, and set of core ethical values. So in some ways that actually means it has far more therapeutic potential than CBT actually does, because it has a greater capacity to transform our character in a permanent way than CBT can potentially do. It changes us at a deeper level, in terms of our whole ideology, as it were, our whole outlook. So it's bigger and deeper than psychotherapy. And these are the things that really attracted me to Stoicism as well. I saw in it meditation techniques, I saw an overlap with psychotherapy, and it just seemed like it brought together everything I was interested in perfectly. And I loved the writings. One of the things I've often said about Stoicism, and this relates to this course in particular, is that in truth, part of the reason that people are attracted to it is because the writings are beautiful and profound and memorable. I like to say not many people get quotes from Aaron Beck or Albert Ellis tattooed on them, but I've met a bunch of people over the years that have Marcus Aurelius quotes tattooed on them, because the Stoics articulated themselves in a way that's survived for 2,000 years. Although that said, we've got the cream of the crop. We've got less than 1% of the Stoic literature surviving, but it's kind of curated for us in a way. It's probably the best 1%, perhaps, or among the better writings. So we've got the cream of the crop. We've got Seneca, one of the greatest writers of antiquity. Marcus Aurelius, also an incredible writer. And even Epictetus, a very different style, but incredibly powerful in his own way. So, one of the things that attracts people to Stoicism also is the beauty of the writings. It's not like modern self-help books in that respect. And that's important because the power, the beauty of the writing has a profound psychological effect on people. They are likely to remember sayings from Marcus Aurelius for the rest of their life, and therefore has a lasting effect on them. So I began giving talks and workshops on Stoicism early on. I began talking to clients because my clients saw that I was interested in it and they would bring it up with me. I wouldn't force my views on clients, but often they were interested in Stoicism, so we ended up discussing how it might be applied within the context of CBT. And that led to me, after quite a while really, eventually I wrote a book on Stoicism and cognitive therapy, which is this one here. It's called The Philosophy of Cognitive Behavioural Therapy. I can't remember the subtitle. Stoic Philosophy is Rational and Cognitive Psychotherapy. It wins an award for longest book title, I think. I wanted to cram rational and cognitive in there. The Philosophy of Cognitive Behavioural Therapy. And basically, the publisher pretty much asked me to write this book. And it was largely an attempt for me to straighten out in my own head a question that was burning inside me, which is, what are the psychological techniques in Stoicism, and how do they relate to the ones in psychotherapy, CBT in particular? And so in that book I gave a pretty thorough overview, and since then I realised there's one or two small things I've noticed that I might go back if I was going to revise it and include, but I'm kind of surprised how comprehensive it was, given how long ago I wrote it. So I did a fairly good job, I think, of covering most of the ground, and Pierre Hadot really had done the work for me. He's a French scholar, historian, classicist, and he'd identified what he called spiritual exercises in the Hellenistic literature, particularly Stoicism. And I read that and I thought, what he calls a spiritual exercise is virtually identical to psychological exercises that I recognise from therapy. I was in a good position to do this because I studied lots of different types of therapy, and I was known as a kind of techniques guy in the psychotherapy field. I learned lots of different techniques and I trained other therapists in them. So I was in a good position to kind of go through and go, this looks like this technique in behaviour therapy, this is like something in REBT, this is like something that Aaron Beck talks about. And I realised that also Beck and Ellis had actually said that Stoicism was the original philosophical inspiration for their work. So that was kind of what led me to write that book. And that led on to some other things, which I'll come onto in a moment. But I just want to, before I do, check in with the chat. Wow, it's zooming up my screen. We've got someone from Arizona, someone from Romania, cool, Austria, Belfast. Well, talk about cosmopolitan. We have people from all over the place. New York, hi Greg, Quebec, Denmark. You like my accent? That's nice. It's the only one I've got. Or I can do other ones, but you probably don't want to hear them. And hi from Nova Scotia. Cool. Maybe if I wave out my window, you'll be able to see me. Okay, so having written this book, it got me talking to a bunch of other people that were interested in the same subject. And the internet was, an amazing tool for bringing together all these people around the world that had an interest in Stoicism, like little fragmented groups, as we can see in this discussion. We're kind of dispersed all over the world. It's like a Stoic diaspora or something. We're kind of in little segments all over the world. But the internet suddenly brings all these communities together, and then we have large communities. Like in the Facebook group, we've got 31,000 people now. And then it develops a kind of momentum. So Chris Gill, who is Professor Emeritus of Ancient Thought at Exeter University, convened this workshop in 2012, and he invited about a dozen people to it, and that included John Sellers, Jules Evans, Tim LeBon, Jill Garrett, myself, a bunch of other people. And it was a multidisciplinary group that we basically formed, and they were classicists, like Chris. There were philosophers like John Sellers. There were psychotherapists like Tim LeBon and myself, and there were research psychologists there as well. And so it was an interdisciplinary or multidisciplinary group, and we started talking about ways that Stoicism could be introduced to the general public. And really it came from a project that one of Chris's students was doing, Patrick Usher, who was, they were looking at how advice from Galen, Marcus Aurelius' physician, could be applied to modern living. And so they thought maybe we could do this with Stoic philosophy as well. That was the beginning of what we now call the Modern Stoicism Project. So let me just say a little bit about that, and then I'm going to come back to the course. So the team run the Stoicism Today blog. We do a whole bunch of things. There are 400 articles or something on there. It's absolutely amazing. Loads of ordinary people from all sorts of backgrounds. I couldn't encourage you more like enthusiastically to go and read it, because it's an amazing resource for people that are interested in Stoicism, and it's edited by Greg Sadler. And Patrick edited 2 books that are collections of articles based on the blog, called Stoicism Today Collected Writings, which is another thing that we do. We also run the Stoicon annual International Stoicism Conference, which I'm organising this year, and it's in Toronto. We've got about 400 people expected to come to that. So if you're interested in coming, you better book a ticket now. And then we have Stoicon X events, which are smaller mini conferences or events in different parts of the world. There's going to be one in Brisbane in Australia. There's one happening in Toronto the day after the main conference. There's one that's just being announced now in London that's been organised by John Sellers. And we run Stoic Week, which is kind of the first thing that we got our teeth into. Again, it was based on this project about Galen. And Stoic Week is a 7-day online course that we run every fall, and we encourage people all around the world to do it. Last year, 3,400 people enrolled on it, and we gather lots of data from it, and we learn a lot about Stoicism and the type of people that are interested from the data that we gather. And then people said, oh, you know, you need a better research protocol to do more meaningful psychological research on it. So I was kind of tasked with designing something that was a bit more rigorous. So we created a 4-week course, which rather than being a kind of introduction to Stoicism, just extracted a handful of core skills and really kind of laboured them, trained them hard for 4 weeks. And we've just finished that. It finished a couple of days ago. It started in 2014, Stoic Mindfulness and Resilience Training, or SMRT it's called. And we had 1,854 participants on it this year. So it kind of gets bigger and bigger every year. Like Stoicism just seems to be growing more and more popular every year. So I facilitate that and Stoic Week, and we've literally just finished doing SMRT. I'm still kind of slightly disorientated from it. I'm still adjusting to normal life. And I guess that leads me on to the course that I'm here to talk about today. For a long time I really wanted to approach the whole thing from a different perspective. So when we were doing Stoic Week, I kind of had this craving. I thought, this is cool, but I want to do something that's more rigorous. So we did like Stoic Mindfulness and Resilience Training. But over the years also, I've always wanted to do a course that approached teaching Stoicism from a different perspective. And that's because of the discussions that I have with people and the debates and arguments that I have with people and that I observe. Because without a doubt, there are certain key misconceptions about Stoicism that keep coming up again and again and again. And one of the main ones is that Stoics are kind of unemotional, or that Stoic acceptance would make people kind of politically passive or whatever. And the best way to respond to that, it seems almost, we could debate the theory of it, is whether it's incorrect as an interpretation of Stoicism, but it's often easier just to kind of point to historical figures and say, well, you know, if you look at the Meditations of Marcus Aurelius, it's clearly not advocating someone who's like a stone or a statue. On virtually every page of the Meditations, Marcus talks about affection, like kind of brotherly love, philanthropy, like towards the rest of mankind. He talks about social virtues like justice on virtually every page. At one point, he actually says justice is the most important virtue, like, you know, not wisdom, but the social virtue of justice. And natural affection, philostorgia, is the basis of Stoic ethics, but it seems to kind of get left out of a lot of discussions. And I think looking closely at Marcus in a rounded way helps to redress that misunderstanding. And the idea about Stoicism being kind of passive, like as the Stoic is a doormat or something, you know, looking at Marcus's life couldn't be more in conflict with that. He was an incredibly hard-working individual who dedicated his life to advancing the Roman Empire and protecting the Roman Empire against invasion. And he was a guy who had no military training whatsoever and went out rode out from Rome to take up more or less permanent residence with the army and take command of the largest army ever massed on a Roman frontier, like from never having, you know, put on a military uniform before. So he was a man of action. There's no question about that. And I think the way I like to describe it is by putting a human face on Stoicism. We approach Stoicism from a different perspective, and it seems much more palatable, and it's much easier, I think, actually to understand what the Stoics are trying to say. Now, ironically, if you look at the Meditations, that's exactly how Marcus approaches the subject himself. As you probably know, in the first book of the Meditations, which many scholars believe was written last and then appended as a preface, often prefaces are the last part of a book to be written, the whole of book one is unique in style compared to the other chapters. What Marcus does is go through and describe all the things that he learnt from various exemplars or role models in his life, and they're all members of his family or his personal tutors. The people he described, as far as I can remember, like every one of them. I think there are about 16 people that he mentions, and particularly his Stoic tutors, who he talks about at length. And the person he talks about most is Antoninus Pius, his adoptive father, the preceding emperor. So he enters into his discussion of Stoicism by looking at role models and exemplars, which should humanise Stoicism for us. Let's see it in a more balanced and rounded way. And I believe that's the best way to teach Stoicism, by looking at Marcus as a role model, an example. And that's not to put him on a pedestal or something like that, but just to say, let's look at an actual living person and how they applied Stoicism. And also, people love Marcus Aurelius and they love the Meditations, but they often don't realise we do know other stuff about him. We have his letters to Fronto, we have speeches allegedly attributed to him, and we have details about him from Cassius Dio, from the Historia Augusta, and from a number of other ancient sources. We know a reasonable amount about, enough to fill a substantial sized biography about Marcus's life. Where it gets really interesting is trying to combine our understanding of Marcus's inner life as a Stoic philosopher, his evolution as a Stoic philosopher, his inner journey, with his outer life and the stages that he went through, the huge transitions that he went through in his outward life as Roman emperor. And so I believe that we can better understand some of the passages in the Meditations by comparing them to real events in Marcus's life, and also very much to real people in his life. But he often had very tense relationships with individuals in his life, and it adds a lot of colour to our understanding of Stoicism. It helps us to understand the Meditations at a much deeper level if we look at some of those relationships. So one in particular would be, for instance, Marcus's relationship with Junius Rusticus, who is almost certainly his main Stoic tutor, and an incredibly interesting guy. He's a direct descendant, I think he's the grandson of one of the main figures in the Stoic opposition to Nero, one of the followers of Thrasea. So he's already somebody who's part of an important Stoic family. He's about 20 years older than Marcus. He becomes his main tutor in philosophy. And Marcus tells us something quite remarkable about his relationship with Rusticus. He says that he used to get pissed off with him. He talks about how he struggled to control his feelings of anger towards Rusticus, but nevertheless we know that throughout his life he was a hugely important figure in Marcus's development as a philosopher. He put enormous trust in him, and so one of the chapters that we're going to look at, one of the sections in the course, is about Stoic approaches to coping with anger, and also to the Stoic idea of mentoring and the role that a tutor had in ancient Stoicism, how that relates to some of the psychological practices that they did. So a couple of other things I should mention. This idea has been in my mind for a long time. The title, How to Think Like a Roman Emperor, actually came from some corporate training courses that I did for Shell, the oil company, nearly 15 years ago. So that gives you an idea how long I've been sitting on this material and mulling it over and revising it and stuff. And I'm also currently in the process of writing a new book on Marcus Aurelius and Stoicism. And that's going to be very different from this course, but it'll be complementary to it. So what does the course give you that you can't get from a book? Well, the videos, the audio exercises, slideshows, there'll be the group discussions, the live chat, quizzes, and there's also a lot of material that just wouldn't go into a book. It's a kind of different concept. Wouldn't necessarily work in a book format. But here we've got a lot more freedom to play around with the material and explore it in different ways. One of the things that people asked a lot about is, this is a 4-week course, it's got live webinars, what if you're going on holiday or something like that? Actually, you can do this course self-paced. The webinars are all recorded on YouTube, and you'll have lifetime access to them and lifetime access to the course materials as well. So you can absolutely do this course self-paced at your own leisure if you want to. There's also a $50 discount for this version, for the pilot version, because it's the first time I'm running it, and I really intend to constantly be revising it. So if you're part of the initial cohort that's doing this first iteration, this first version of the course, you're going to get quite a substantial discount off the price. That's already deducted from the price that's on the enroll button. Some people ask me about that. But it also means, because you have lifetime access, that when it's revised and expanded and improved, you'll get access to everything that's added to it anyway. So the content of the course, it begins with a general introduction to Stoicism. I've done a recording that lasts about 30 minutes. I'm going to probably split it into 3 10-minute segments. So it's just like a real overview of Stoic moral psychology, Stoic ethics, the Stoic goal of life, the kind of essential doctrines of Stoicism. And then each of the weeks focus on a different practical topic, because that's the feedback I got from people. Like the main thing they wanted highlighted was a different application. So the first section is about coping with anger and developing empathy in Stoicism, which is something that seems to be very neglected in a lot of discussions of Stoicism, but it's huge in the Meditations. Marcus goes on and on about it, and it's extremely important because it's integral to our understanding of the social dimension of Stoicism. And the second week is about coping with worry and anxiety. And again, I mentioned that Marcus says he gets angry. We know that Marcus suffered with a lot of worry and anxiety. He seems, some people say he seems depressed in the Meditations. I don't think that's true. I think he's using standard Stoic formulas that people confuse with melancholy. From all that we know about him, he wasn't a depressed character at all. He was pretty cheerful. But we do know that he suffered from anxiety during the early years of his reign, because he talks about in his letters to Fronto, and he's worried about the health of his friends, he's worried about matters of state. So we can imagine in the Meditations, when he's talking about coping with anxiety, we can see this as his evolution. Here was a young guy thrust into this incredible position that he was reluctant to get into. He's hit with one catastrophe after another. The River Tiber floods, homes are destroyed, there's a crisis, it's followed by a famine because farm animals are destroyed. There's a malaria epidemic, and then the Parthian War begins. The Parthians invade Armenia, and he's thrown into a war after a long period of peace under Antoninus. So there's just one catastrophe after another. There was an earthquake at that time as well. So it's not surprising that he was kind of worried about what was going on. But in the Meditations, we have a pretty good indication of how Marcus coped with his worry and anxiety. So that's a little bit about what we're covering in week 2. And then week 3 is Stoicism in coping with chronic pain and illness. Again, Marcus, some scholars believe he had something like a stomach ulcer. There's a lot of references to his pain and illness. He was so sick that in 175 AD, it seems to have been widely believed that he was on the verge of dying. And there, again, are many references to death in the Meditations, which are probably in part formulaic, but Marcus was a guy who probably came close to death, and so they have a particular resonance for him as well. And he talks about the ways that he coped with physical pain. We also know he struggled on the northern frontier. He wasn't a physically fit guy. There are a lot of references to that. And he suffered from illness. He struggled with insomnia and with the cold climate. So we'll look at what he says about Stoicism as a way of coping with discomfort, pain, illness. And the final section is about Stoicism and death, loss, bereavement, melancholy, and there's a great deal that the Stoics have to say about that. And Marcus had to endure many bereavements, partly because he lived longer than most Romans. So he saw a lot of his friends. Half of his children died. He lost about 5 children during his lifetime. And he saw many of his close friends. His brother, who he loved very dearly, Lucius Verus, died suddenly. And also Marcus lived during the Antonine Plague, where it's estimated that 5 million people died in the empire, so he was surrounded by death. And we'll look at how the Stoics cope with that. So in terms of the structure, there's going to be a live webinar at the start of each week discussing the topic, and then there'll be videos on each topic. There are stories and anecdotes from Marcus's life to help illustrate the key concepts, and then there's a discussion of relevant passages in the meditations, as well as key excerpts, quizzes or knowledge checks, and group discussions to help consolidate the learning. And there's also a private Facebook group for people who've done the course to discuss the Stoicism of Marcus Aurelius and social media if they want. And there's also new audio recordings that I've made, better quality audio recordings, new exercises for guided meditation. So that's basically the format. And like I say, although we'll be going through it over 4 weeks, which is a format that I think works quite well, I know a lot of people can't follow that schedule, so everything you'll have lifetime access to. The webinars are recorded, so you can absolutely do the whole thing at your own pace if that suits you better. So I'm just going to check in briefly with the live chat and have a look at what people are saying. People from Germany. Would you say the course's exercises on anxiety and pain are strictly Stoic, or are they informed by a therapeutic background? Will it incorporate second and third wave behaviour therapy concepts? Yeah, the books that I wrote, the self-help books that I wrote in Stoicism and the Art of Happiness, there's quite a lot of CBT in that. And there's also this book on resilience, this one is Stoicism with a bit of CBT. This is CBT, third wave CBT with a bit of Stoicism in it, basically. And so I think it's necessary to do that, because the Stoics weren't writing protocols or manuals or handbooks. We have discussions, we have letters, we have Marcus's aphorisms to himself. We have to do a lot of joining the dots. And often there are just practical tips that they don't really give us about doing some of the exercises. And so I think it's much easier to understand those if we look at similar exercises that are used in modern cognitive therapy. And also there are do's and don'ts. In particular, the negative visualization, or premeditation of adversity, as I prefer to call it. I meet a lot of people who tell me that they struggle with that exercise, and it's very similar to a whole range of techniques in modern therapy that we call imaginal exposure, that every therapist does on a regular basis. And so we know there are simple do's and don'ts about those kind of exercises that the Stoics don't really discuss, but are incredibly important when you're teaching somebody how to actually apply them in practice. How specifically exercise and structure of the course differs from those at SMRT? What are the differences in outcome? I wanted to make it as different as I could from SMRT. So, in short, that was my goal. I didn't want to reinvent the wheel. I wanted to do something very different. And actually, I thought one of the easiest ways to do that is to make it much more focused around the personality of Marcus Aurelius and using him as a role model or an example. Again, without putting him on a pedestal, but saying, well, let's look at a person, let's look at his life and how he applied Stoicism. So I think approaching it from that radically different perspective basically means that the whole course has a very different look and feel, and there's a lot of different content on it. SMRT doesn't really specifically focus on coping with pain, managing anger, things like that. It's a bit more generic. It's maybe a little bit more focused on anxiety. So it's not anywhere near as broad in scope as the Roman Emperor course. And it doesn't have the kind of literary aspect to it. It's not really looking at the Stoic writings and the history and stuff. It doesn't put the human face on Stoicism. So it has a very different look and feel. And because of that, we end up also looking at very different topics. The time day for the live webinars, when is it? The feedback that I've had so far was that people preferred 2 p.m. Eastern time on a Sunday for the webinars. So I know you're never going to find a time that suits absolutely everybody, but Sunday seems to work well. We found the Sunday was the preferred date for starting SMRT, and so I think it makes sense to do the webinar at the beginning of the week, because then it acts as a way to kick off with an overview. So that's why we do it on Sunday, and 2 p.m. Eastern time seems to be a good time for the majority of people, and that's what we're going to follow on this course as well. Okay, so I think those are all the questions for now. So I just wanted to wrap things up by saying thanks to everybody who's taking part. I couldn't do it without you. I've been incredibly fortunate, like I said, to find myself in a situation where I get to talk to thousands of people from all over the world about my favourite subject, my hobby, Stoicism. I always used to say that I learned far more from talking to my clients in therapy than I did from books and training and workshops and other therapists, although those are also really important. Well, I've also learned far more about Stoicism, I think, from talking to people about it and from listening to their discussions, and for that I'm incredibly grateful. If you're interested in joining me on this course, then just follow the link to the main course page or to my website, which is just donaldrobertson.name. I know it's a weird URL. It's just donaldrobertson, all one word, .name. I think there might even be a link to it in the YouTube player that you can just click on. Or I'll add a link when the video on YouTube goes permanent in the permanent comments area. As always, if you've got any comments or questions for me, just feel free to email me. You can do that via the contact page on my website. It's the way that people usually do it. I get tons of emails. Every morning I go through my emails, and I usually have a stack of them from people all over the world, and I answer every one of them. And sometimes it'll be brief. Like if you send me a really long email, it's probably going to take me a while to get around to answering it, and I'll probably give you a short answer, but I answer every email I get from people. So please don't hesitate to get in touch if you have any questions. So I look forward to seeing you in the course, but until then, it's goodbye once again from me, and goodbye from, you want to say goodbye, Mickey Dog? Goodbye, Mickey Dog? Yep. Goodbye from Mickey, the now officially the course dog.